Humanity's place in the galaxy had always been mocked by the other races of the universe. Earth was a primitive backwater, its inhabitants barely able to scratch the surface of intergalactic technology, while the galaxy's more powerful civilizations flaunted their colossal fleets and advanced weaponry. Earth had barely managed to send a single ship beyond their home planet. The rest of the galaxy had long written humanity off as insignificant, a species too young to even dream of competing. But the Vanguard was humanity's defiant answer to that dismissal. A single ship cobbled together from scraps of outdated technology and salvaged parts. It wasn't much to look at. The Vanguard was slow, its weapons primitive compared to the galaxy's elites, and its shields barely strong enough to stop a glancing blow from a standard laser cannon. Yet it was humanity's last hope, a symbol of their refusal to surrender no matter how unlikely the odds. At first, no one took it seriously. When Captain Adrian Cross stood before the Vanguard's command deck for the first time, even the high-ranking officials on Earth doubted the ship's potential. The Vanguard wasn't even a fleet, it was just one ship, and that ship was outclassed in every way imaginable. Earth was still finding its place in the galactic arena, trying to make a mark where others thought it impossible. But Captain Cross saw something others didn't. Beneath its worn surface, the Vanguard represented the indomitable spirit of humanity, something the galaxy had yet to encounter. The ship was tasked with patrolling the outer rim of Earth's holdings, watching over the fragile human colonies that dotted the edges of known space. Captain Cross had taken command with the knowledge that humanity was alone. No allies, no powerful fleets, just a ship and a crew willing to risk everything. For years, the Vanguard fought small skirmishes with raiders and hostile entities, never venturing too deep into galactic space, always avoiding the larger conflicts that raged between the powerful galactic empires. There were whispers, jokes, really from the more advanced species. One message to the Vanguard's communications was simply, "Is that rust bucket still alive?" Another mocked, "Enjoy being the galaxy's punching bag human." Yet Captain Cross and his crew never faltered. They kept fighting, always in the shadows, always proving that despite their lack of numbers, humanity could still stand. And then came the war, a conflict between the galaxy's superpowers. The Zorath Empire, the Sinindra Collective, and the Tyrannic Order erupted across the galaxy. Control of valuable star systems was at stake, and every faction sent their mightiest fleets into the fray. As the war escalated, the human fleet had no place on the front lines. There were only the Vanguard and the few embattled colonies that Earth held. Yet Earth was ordered to make a stand. The Council on Earth had made a decision. The Vanguard would join the war. Captain Cross had protested. His crew had protested. They knew the odds. They knew their ship would be outmatched. But orders were orders. They had no choice. With a mix of fear and defiance, they prepared for the inevitable. The Vanguard entered the battlefield with all the subtlety of a freight train. They arrived at the outer edges of the Zorath Empire's space, where a massive Zorath fleet was poised to destroy one of humanity's last remaining colonies. The Zorath Empire had long been considered the most powerful military force in the galaxy, its massive dreadnoughts dominating any battlefield they encountered. The Vanguard was nothing, just a speck in the distance. The first skirmish was almost comical. The Vanguard was spotted, but it wasn't seen as a threat. The Zorath fleet with its advanced weaponry barely even acknowledged the Vanguard's presence. Captain Cross stood on the bridge, watching as the Zorath ships, sleek, powerful, spread out before him. The crew was tense, eyes darting between the readouts and the dark space ahead. "You know what to do," Cross said, his voice cold and steady. "Target their rear flank, fire on my mark." The Vanguard's weapons, aged and patched together, flared to life, sending a series of missile barges into the heart of the Zorath fleet. It was a desperate attack, and to the Zorath, it was laughable. The Vanguard's missiles were nothing compared to their vast arsenal, but then something unexpected happened. The first Zorath ship, a smaller support vessel, took a hit directly to its fuel core. The explosion was massive, taking down several smaller ships in the process. "Direct hit, Captain," reported Lieutenant Hayward, his eyes wide. We actually did it." The Zorath fleet turned its focus on the Vanguard, launching an all-out barrage of energy weapons at the ship. The Vanguard's shields flared and crackled under the assault, but they held, barely. The ship's aging armor groaned with every hit, but it didn't break. Captain Cross remained calm, his hands steady on the console. "Return fire, focus on their command vessel." They were outmatched, they were outgunned, but humanity wasn't going to let the galaxy think it was weak anymore. Another volley hit, this time smashing into the side of one of the Zorath dreadnoughts. A small crack formed in its hull, and the Zorath began to panic. For the first time, they hesitated. The Vanguard was supposed to be nothing, a joke, but now it was changing the tide. The galaxy watched as the Vanguard's missile barrage took out another smaller Zorath ship. The massive enemy fleet faltered just for a moment. That was all they needed. The Vanguard had struck fear into them. They weren't laughing anymore. The Zorath fleet hesitated for only a moment, but that brief moment was enough. It was the opening they needed, the first sign of doubt among the galaxy's most feared empire. The Vanguard had done the unthinkable. It had forced them to stop and reassess their situation. Captain Cross wasn't naive enough to believe that this would win the battle. He knew the Zorath would retaliate with overwhelming force, but he also knew that they had made a crucial error. They'd underestimated humanity, and that mistake would cost them. "Concentrate fire on their secondary dreadnoughts," Cross ordered, his voice cutting through the chaos of the bridge. "We need to keep them off balance. If they regain their composure, we'll be swarmed." "Aye, Captain," Lieutenant Hayward responded, already inputting the new targets. The Vanguard fired again, a volley of missiles and laser blasts that struck the smaller dreadnoughts with precision. The crew could hear the distant echoes of explosions as they sent shock waves through the Zorath formation. But the Zorath weren't so easily shaken. "Enemy reinforcements en route," reported Ensign Jensen from the scanners. "Another fleet, larger than the first, just dropped out of hyperspace." Captain Cross's stomach tightened. He had known this would happen. The Zorath fleet would regroup, and they would send in everything they had. Humanity's single ship, the Vanguard, would be no match for their numbers. "We need to get out of here, Captain," Lieutenant Hayward urged, glancing nervously at the increasing number of enemy ships on the screens. "We're too outnumbered." Cross didn't respond immediately. His mind was racing, weighing the odds. His gut told him they weren't going to survive this fight, not without reinforcements, not without a miracle. But if they retreated now, it would be a humiliating blow to humanity's reputation. They would become nothing more than the joke the galaxy had always seen them as. "Right, Hayward," Cross finally said, his voice hard. "We're not going to make it if we stay here, but I'm not leaving empty-handed." The Vanguard's engines roared as it shifted into evasive maneuvers, cutting through the swarming Zorath ships with an agility that defied logic. The ship wasn't built for this kind of combat, but Captain Cross had learned to use every advantage, every small flaw in the enemy's tactics. The Zorath had been trained to fight against massive fleets, against well-organized armies, not a single scrappy human ship that could barely hold itself together. Cross glanced at the tactical display. "All remaining power to the aft shields. We'll make a break for the asteroid field near Sector 7. The Zorath can't chase us in there." He knew it was a risk, leading them into a field full of sharp, unpredictable asteroids, but it was their best shot at survival. The Zorath ships would have a harder time tracking them, and the Vanguard could use the terrain to its advantage. For a ship built out of old parts and patched-together technology, agility was their only hope. "Boosting power to shields," reported Hayward, his fingers flying over the controls as the Vanguard accelerated, its old engines whining in protest. The Zorath fleet pursued, firing everything they had. Energy blasts hit the ship, shuddering through the hull, but somehow they held. The ship's shields flickered, on the verge of collapse, but the Vanguard kept pushing forward, heading straight for the asteroid field. Behind them, the Zorath unleashed a wave of firepower, and a massive explosion rocked the Vanguard, throwing the ship violently off course. The lights flickered on the bridge and alarms blared, but Cross held his ground, gripping the edge of the command chair. "Status," he barked. "We've lost one of the aft stabilizers, Captain," Ensign Jensen reported, her voice tight with tension. "We're losing speed." "Damn it," Cross swore, pounding his fist on the armrest. "We can't afford to slow down now. Get those stabilizers fixed, now." The crew worked quickly, pulling every lever, flicking every switch, trying to keep the Vanguard moving. Outside, the Zorath fleet was closing in, their ships slicing through the darkness like sharks hunting in a blood-red sea. Captain Cross didn't hesitate. He had no time for doubt. He was all too aware of the consequences if they didn't make it into the asteroid field. The Zorath were relentless, and once they had the Vanguard cornered, there would be no escape. "Now," Jensen, Cross yelled. The young ensign hit a final button, and the ship lurched forward as its remaining engines roared to life. The Vanguard shot forward just as a Zorath dreadnought fired its primary cannon at them, missing by inches. The massive energy blast burned a hole in the space behind them, sending shock waves through the ship's hull. The Vanguard entered the asteroid field at full speed, the Zorath fleet hot on their tail. Inside the field, the ship danced between the jagged rocks, weaving in and out of the dense cluster of asteroids. For a moment, the pursuit slowed as the Zorath struggled to navigate the dangerous terrain, but Captain Cross knew it wouldn't last long. "We have a few minutes, maybe," he said grimly. "We need to find a way to turn the tables." The Vanguard's weapons were limited, but it had one advantage no one had anticipated. It wasn't just a ship, it was a symbol. And for humanity, that might be enough to win this fight. As the Vanguard weaved through the asteroid field, the ship groaned under the strain, its aging frame protesting with every sudden turn. The crew, though used to the ship's quirks, could feel the weight of their situation pressing down on them. The Zorath fleet was close behind, their pursuit slowed only by the obstacles in the asteroid field. But soon enough, the Vanguard's luck would run out. The Zorath had the firepower, they had the numbers. The only thing humanity had was its grit, and even that might not be enough. "Captain, we're losing power in the port thrusters," Lieutenant Hayward reported, his voice strained with the effort of trying to keep the ship on course. "We can't keep this up much longer." "We don't need to keep it up for much longer," Cross replied, his jaw tight. His mind was working at 1,000 mph. The Vanguard wasn't going to outrun them forever, and if they didn't act soon, they'd be sitting ducks. "Get me a scan of their formation. I need to know where their weak points are." Jensen's hands flew across the console as she quickly pulled up a tactical scan. The Zorath ships were tightly packed, most of them following the lead of the two dreadnoughts. Cross took in the information, his brow furrowing. He could see what they were doing. The Zorath were trying to box them in, using the asteroid field as a barrier to prevent any chance of escape. "It's a trap," Cross muttered to himself. "They think they have us cornered." "They're not wrong, Captain," Hayward said grimly. "But they're underestimating one thing." "What's that?" "Us." Cross looked back at his crew, seeing the same determination in their eyes. They knew what they had to do, even if it meant taking a massive risk. There was no turning back now. Either the Vanguard would make it stand, or it would be destroyed. And if it was to fall, it would take the Zorath down with it. "All right, here's the plan," Cross said, his voice calm despite the storm raging outside. "We're going to split their formation. I'll need you all to hold it together and trust me." He looked at each of his crew members, knowing this might be the last time he had a chance to speak to them before the chaos fully erupted. But there was no fear, only resolve. "Jensen, you're going to fire a decoy burst from the starboard side. We'll make them think we're breaking right. When they start following that lead, Hayward, I want you to cut power to the forward thrusters for a split second, then jam their targeting systems. We'll use the asteroid field to mask our approach." Hayward looked uncertain for a moment, but then he nodded. "Got it. But if this goes wrong—" "It won't," Cross interrupted. "It can't." Cross's hand hovered over the controls, waiting for the perfect moment. Outside the Vanguard, the Zorath dreadnoughts and their accompanying ships were closing in, forming a nearly impenetrable wall. The asteroids swirled around them, a swirling mass of rocks and debris that could provide some cover if they used them wisely. The countdown began in his mind. 1 second, 2, 3. "Now," Cross said, and in an instant everything fell into place. Jensen fired the decoy burst, a brilliant flash of energy that streaked across space and caught the attention of the Zorath ships. The Zorath fleet, eager to trap their prey, shifted formation. They took the bait. Half of them began to veer off in pursuit of the Vanguard's false trail. At the same time, Hayward pulled the lever, cutting the Vanguard's forward thrusters just as Cross had instructed. The ship lurched and slowed, then immediately jerked back to life, its engines sputtering and flaring. The Zorath, anticipating the Vanguard's movements, locked onto their target, but they couldn't adjust in time. The Vanguard's shields flared up again, absorbing the first few shots as they blasted through the thinning Zorath formation. The Vanguard turned sharply, dodging incoming fire and pressed into the heart of the asteroid field. "Deploy the rear mines," Cross ordered. "Let's make sure they don't follow us too closely." The rear mines launched from the Vanguard's hull, creating a cloud of explosive devices just behind them. The Zorath ships, caught off guard, couldn't pull out of the asteroid field quickly enough. The mines detonated in a fiery explosion that lit up the dark space. The Zorath ships, struggling to navigate the debris, collided with some of the larger asteroids or were caught in the blast, their engines going dark. "Direct hit," Jensen reported, her voice a mixture of surprise and satisfaction. "We've taken down at least 3 of their ships." Cross allowed himself a brief moment of satisfaction, but he didn't have time to savor it. The remaining Zorath ships were still closing in, and they were angry. "We've just bought ourselves a little more time," he said. "Now we need to make it count." The Vanguard pushed deeper into the asteroid field, weaving through the jagged rocks with expert precision. The ship was old and it was straining under the constant stress, but Cross could feel the adrenaline of the crew. They were alive, and for now they were winning. But Cross knew this was just the beginning. The Zorath had underestimated them before. Now they would be looking for blood. "We're not out of this yet," Cross said, his voice steady. "But they're going to learn something today. We might be small, we might be outgunned, but humanity will never go down without a fight." The Vanguard pressed deeper into the asteroid field, its engines whining as they pushed past their limits. Every twist and turn of the ship felt like a gamble, but Cross had always trusted his instincts. His crew trusted him, and as long as they stuck together, they might just have a chance. The Zorath, on the other hand, were furious. The remaining ships, now fewer in number, roared through the asteroid field, navigating its deadly labyrinth with ruthless precision. They had suffered losses, but they were still a formidable force, and they were not going to let one human ship mock them. "They're closing in, Captain," Ensign Jensen reported. Her hands flew across the console, a tightness in her voice. "If we don't make a move soon, they'll trap us." Cross's jaw tightened. He had no illusions about their situation. The Zorath ships might be fewer, but they had the firepower, the discipline, and the will to destroy the Vanguard. No matter how fast or agile it was still a target, and if they didn't make it out of this asteroid field, that would be the end of humanity's defiant stand. "Bring up the tactical display. I need to see their positions," Cross ordered. Jensen complied, her screen flickering before displaying a 3D map of the asteroid field and the remaining Zorath ships. 3 dreadnoughts, each heavily armed and armored, had broken off from the rest of the fleet and were now pushing forward, following the Vanguard through the debris. Behind them, a handful of smaller ships flanked the larger vessels, creating a blockade. "They're trying to corner us," Hayward said grimly, his fingers tapping on the control panel. "If they're trying to box us in, we need to break out fast." Cross studied the display, his mind racing. The asteroid field was a mess of sharp rocks, but it wasn't impossible to navigate. The Vanguard had enough power left to make one more desperate push. It was risky, but they didn't have a choice. Hayward prepped the forward thrusters for a burst. "When I give the word, I want you to engage them full throttle." The lieutenant didn't question the order. He understood exactly what Cross was asking. The Zorath ships, now just a few clicks away, were becoming more aggressive. They opened fire, their weapons blasting through the asteroid field, trying to drive the Vanguard into a corner. The Vanguard's shields held, but each hit sent a violent shock through the ship's frame. "Hold steady," Cross muttered under his breath, his knuckles white against the command chair. "We're not done yet." "Captain, they've targeted our port side," Jensen warned. "They're preparing to fire." A direct hit. Cross's eyes locked onto the incoming trajectory of the shot. They were too close. He could already hear the hum of the Zorath's cannon charging up. "Now Hayward, full throttle." With a sharp motion, Hayward engaged the thrusters, and the Vanguard shot forward like a bullet from a gun. The ship lurched forward, sending the crew gripping their seats as the powerful burst of speed pushed them through a narrow gap between 2 asteroids. The Zorath, unable to adjust in time, fired their blast too early. The shot missed, smashing into the massive asteroid ahead of them, sending a wave of debris careening through space. The Vanguard barely avoided it, but the ship's hull took a glancing hit, scraping against a smaller rock. The sound echoed through the ship, a horrifying screech that rattled every plate and panel. "Damage report," Cross barked. "Minor hull breach on the starboard side," Lieutenant Hayward replied. "We've lost some auxiliary power, but we're still functional." Cross gritted his teeth. "Keep us moving, don't stop, we have to outrun them." The Zorath fleet, now more determined than ever to destroy the Vanguard, gave chase, their ships firing relentlessly as they pursued. The Vanguard wasn't built for prolonged combat. It was a ship of survival, built to avoid and outmaneuver, not to face the full force of a fleet head-on. "Captain, there's an opening," Jensen said, her eyes wide. We can make it. There's an exit on the far side of the field. Cross glanced at the screen. It was a narrow opening, barely large enough to fit the Vanguard through, but it was their only chance to escape. Lock onto that exit. All power to shields, Cross commanded. We're going through no matter what. The Vanguard surged forward, weaving between asteroids and enemy fire. The crew's nerves were stretched thin, their every movement a frantic effort to keep the ship from falling apart. The Zorath ships didn't relent, closing the gap with terrifying speed. Their weapons flashed, narrowly missing the Vanguard as it darted through the field, a blur of desperate determination. The exit loomed ahead, just a sliver of space between two massive asteroids. It was the only way out, but it also posed a danger of its own. The Vanguard would have to make a perfect turn to fit through. Hold steady, Cross commanded. They were almost there. The Zorath were right behind them, their weapons still lighting up the black void of space, the sound of energy blasts echoing across the ship's hull. For a moment it seemed like the Vanguard wouldn't make it, like the narrow gap would close just as they reached it. Then, with a final burst of speed, the Vanguard shot through the opening, the hull scraping against the edges of the asteroids. For a terrifying second, it felt like the ship might shatter under the pressure, but they made it. The Vanguard shot into open space, free of the asteroid field. Behind them, the Zorath fleet was caught in the debris, momentarily disoriented by the massive explosion caused by the asteroids and the Vanguard's narrow escape. But it wouldn't last. The Zorath would soon recover and continue their pursuit. For now, however, they were safe. For now, they had time to breathe. Captain Cross leaned back in his chair, staring out into the vastness of space. He knew this was just the beginning. The Zorath had tasted blood, and they would be coming for them. But for the first time in a long while, Cross allowed himself a small, triumphant smile. "Let them come," he said softly. "We're not done yet." The Vanguard had made it out of the asteroid field, but it was far from free. The Zorath fleet, though temporarily disrupted, wasn't finished. They had sustained losses, but they still had the numbers, the power, and the drive to crush this human ship once and for all. It wasn't just about winning the battle anymore. It was about proving that the galaxy's mocking view of humanity would not be allowed to stand. Cross leaned over the command console, his fingers running through his hair. He could feel the tension on the bridge, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. Every decision he made was a gamble. Every risk he took could mean the end. The Vanguard was damaged badly. The engines had suffered multiple hits, and the hull was no longer as sturdy as it had been at the beginning of this journey. The Zorath had clearly underestimated them before, but now they would be more determined than ever to finish what they'd started. "Captain, the Zorath are regrouping," Ensign Jensen said, her eyes glued to the screen. "They're forming up again. Larger formation this time. They're going to cut us off." Cross stood still for a moment, considering their options. They were trapped in a stretch of space where there was nowhere to hide. No asteroid field, no debris to use for cover, just endless space, a wide-open battleground. It was as if the galaxy itself was challenging them to face the truth. Earth wasn't meant to be here. "Can we outmaneuver them?" Cross asked, though he already knew the answer. They couldn't, not with their damaged ship. "We're still faster than them," Hayward replied, his voice tight. "But not by much. We've pushed the engines too far." Cross looked out into the vast expanse of space. The cold, empty darkness of it seemed endless. The Zorath ships would be on them within minutes. It would be over before they had a chance to think. He had always known that this mission was a long shot. He knew the Vanguard wasn't built for war, that humanity was punching far above its weight. But there was one thing he hadn't allowed himself to consider. What if this was it? What if this was humanity's final stand? But Cross refused to accept that. Not after everything they had fought for, not after every insult, every mocking word from the galaxy. Earth had been laughed at for too long. Now it was time to show them what humanity was made of. He straightened, a renewed sense of purpose coursing through him. "Set a course for the nearest planet. I want us to land and hide in their atmosphere. They'll follow us down, and we'll make sure they don't have an easy time of it." "You want to land on a planet?" Hayward asked, a skeptical look crossing his face. "That's crazy. The Vanguard isn't designed for atmospheric entry." "We're not doing this to survive, Hayward," Cross said, his voice low and steady. "We're doing this to end it. We're going to make the Zorath regret underestimating us." He turned to Jensen. "Get me the coordinates. We're taking this fight to the ground." Jensen didn't hesitate. She punched in the coordinates for the nearest planet, an uninhabited rock, perfect for a last-ditch battle. It wasn't ideal, it wasn't safe, but if they were going down, they were going to make sure they took some Zorath ships with them. As the Vanguard began its descent toward the planet, the Zorath fleet followed, not realizing what Cross had planned. They assumed the human ship was trying to escape into the atmosphere to hide, and in a way, they were right. But the Vanguard wasn't just hiding, it was preparing to fight back. The Vanguard's engine screamed in protest as they pushed the ship down into the planet's atmosphere. The heat shields flared bright orange as they entered the thick clouds, the ship shaking violently as it struggled to maintain control. Cross gripped the armrests of his chair, eyes locked on the console in front of him. "Steady," he muttered under his breath. "Steady." The Vanguard trembled as it fought the atmosphere, the descent slow but controlled. They were getting closer to the ground, and Cross knew the Zorath would follow. But what they didn't know was that the Vanguard had a trick up its sleeve. The ship's sensors, while outdated, still had one key advantage: the ability to use the planet's natural magnetic field to scramble enemy targeting systems. "Hayward, engage the system," Cross ordered. The lieutenant didn't hesitate. He flicked a switch, and the Vanguard's magnetic scrambler came to life. The Zorath fleet, just moments away from opening fire, suddenly found their targeting system scrambled. Their shots went wide, some missing by miles, others crashing into the dense clouds of gas surrounding the planet. "Now," Cross said, his voice low, "we fight." The Vanguard made a sharp turn, banking toward the planet's surface. With the Zorath disoriented, they couldn't lock onto their target quickly enough. The Vanguard fired a series of well-placed missiles aimed not at the Zorath ships themselves, but at the atmospheric entry points. The missiles struck the atmosphere's fragile barrier, igniting a series of explosions that sent shock waves through the Zorath fleet. "They're disoriented," Jensen called out. "They're breaking formation." Cross didn't give them time to recover. The Vanguard dropped low, skimming just above the planet's surface as it dodged incoming fire from the Zorath. The ship was battered, but it wasn't done yet. It was alive, and that was all that mattered. "We've got a chance," Hayward said, his voice full of disbelief. "We're actually doing this." "Don't get too comfortable," Cross replied. "We've got more Zorath ships incoming. This fight is far from over." The Zorath fleet was regrouping, their frustration evident as they tried to regain control. But Cross had already given his crew the only advantage they needed: the element of surprise. They would keep pushing, keep fighting until the Zorath realized that humanity wasn't going to be the galaxy's punching bag anymore. The Vanguard roared through the atmosphere, its hull barely holding together as it skimmed just inches above the jagged landscape of the planet below. The Zorath ships, disoriented by the magnetic scramble and their failed targeting attempts, were struggling to regroup. They weren't used to fighting in such chaotic conditions, and that gave humanity its one advantage. But that advantage wouldn't last long. The Zorath were quick learners, and once they recovered, they'd unleash everything they had. "Captain incoming," Jensen warned, her voice tight with urgency. "They've adjusted their targeting systems. They're locking on again." Cross's gaze hardened as he looked out at the turbulent skies, watching as the massive Zorath dreadnoughts adjusted their positions, their cannons beginning to power up once more. "We've got to keep them off us, or this is the end," Cross muttered, more to himself than anyone else. He glanced at Hayward. "What's our power status?" "Shields are at 20%, Captain," Hayward replied, his face tense. "We're running on fumes and the engines are overheating. If we don't get out of this atmosphere soon, we won't have the thrust to escape." "Then we fight our way out," Cross said, his voice steady, unwavering. "Prepare the rear mines for launch. We'll give them one last surprise." Jensen quickly began activating the rear mine launcher, while Hayward adjusted the ship's flight path to ensure the mines were positioned for maximum impact. "We're going to need a miracle to survive this," Hayward muttered under his breath as his hands flew across the console. "Miracles are for the desperate," Cross responded, his eyes hard with resolve. "We make our own luck." The Vanguard turned sharply, diving deeper into the planet's atmosphere. It wasn't just the terrain that posed a threat now. The ship was descending rapidly, and the sky above was filled with the looming shapes of Zorath ships closing in. If they didn't act fast, they would be caught in a deadly trap. "Ready, Captain?" Jensen called, her voice shaking with both tension and excitement. "The mines are armed. On your mark." Cross's hands tightened on the controls, his mind racing. He could hear the thunderous blast of energy from the Zorath cannons as they fired, their aim still off thanks to the planet's magnetic interference. The Vanguard shook violently as a bolt of energy skimmed past them, narrowly missing its target. Now, Cross commanded. The rear mines were launched, each one streaking into the sky behind them, right toward the oncoming Zorath ships. The Vanguard turned sharply again, the ship bucking under the stress as it twisted through the air. The Zorath fleet followed, eager to finish off their prey, unaware of the deadly trap now set in place. The mines detonated with a series of brilliant flashes, the shock waves rippling through the air. The Zorath fleet had no time to react, their ships colliding with the mines. The resulting explosions scattered debris across the sky. Several smaller Zorath ships were completely obliterated in the blast, their remains disintegrating in the fiery aftermath. "We've taken down 3 more, Captain," Jensen exclaimed, her voice rising with triumph. But Cross wasn't celebrating. He knew this wasn't the end. There were still far too many Zorath ships out there, and their chances of survival were growing slimmer by the second. "Don't let up, keep moving. We've got to get out of here now," Cross ordered, his voice unwavering despite the chaos around him. The Vanguard surged forward, cutting through the turbulent atmosphere at a blistering speed. The remaining Zorath ships, though wounded, were relentless in their pursuit. Their cannons fired again, energy blasts narrowly missing the Vanguard as the ship dodged and weaved between towering mountains and violent storms. "We're losing altitude," Hayward shouted. "The engines can't keep up with this pace. We need to level out." The ship was becoming sluggish, the atmosphere pressing down harder as they got lower to the ground. It was a race against time. The Vanguard was beginning to overheat, and their fuel reserves were quickly depleting. The Zorath would soon catch them again if they couldn't find a way to break free. Cross glanced at the horizon ahead. He could see a vast canyon cutting through the planet's surface, a narrow escape route that might just be their salvation. If they could get there, they could lose the Zorath in the twisting turns, using the canyon's natural defenses to keep them off their tail. "Take us to that canyon," Cross ordered, pointing toward the narrowing chasm ahead. "We can lose them in there." "Are you insane?" Hayward shouted, his eyes wide with disbelief. "We're going to crash." "We don't have a choice," Cross replied, a grim determination in his voice. "We either make it through that canyon or we die trying." Without waiting for further argument, he took control of the ship's flight path, steering the Vanguard into the canyon with precision. The ship shuddered as the narrow walls of the canyon loomed closer, their jagged edges seeming to close in on them. The Zorath fleet, closing in quickly, were right behind. "Brace for impact," Cross shouted. The Vanguard dipped and swerved, narrowly avoiding rocks as it rocketed through the canyon. The Zorath ships followed, but they were not built for such tight maneuvers. They were slower, unable to navigate the narrow turns with the same agility as the Vanguard. The sound of their cannons echoed through the canyon walls as they tried to catch up, but the Vanguard kept pushing forward, dodging at the last possible moment. Suddenly, one of the Zorath ships clipped a canyon wall, sending it spiraling into the rocks. It exploded in a brilliant flash, sending shock waves through the narrow passage. The remaining Zorath ships hesitated momentarily, disoriented by the explosion. Now was their chance. "Full power to the engines," Cross commanded. "Push through." With one final surge of energy, the Vanguard shot through the canyon's end, leaving the Zorath fleet behind. The ship broke free into the open sky, the planet's surface far below. For a moment they were free, but Cross knew the Zorath would not give up. They would be back, and when they came, they would be even angrier than before. For now, though, they had survived, and that was something the galaxy wouldn't soon forget. The Vanguard shot into the open skies, leaving the planet's atmosphere behind. The vastness of space greeted them once more, a cold reminder that while they had escaped the immediate danger, the real fight was far from over. Captain Cross let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. They had made it, barely. The Vanguard was badly damaged, its systems barely holding together, and the crew was on the edge. But they were alive, and for now, that had to be enough. "Damage report," Cross barked, his eyes scanning the readouts in front of him. "Shields are down to 10%, Captain," Hayward responded, his voice strained. "The engines are critical, and we've lost the starboard thruster completely. We've got power, but it's fatting fast." Jensen was already working furiously at her console. "Hull integrity is compromised. We've got multiple breaches across the ship, and our life support systems are working at reduced capacity. We can't take much more of this." Cross rubbed his temples. "How much longer can we stay out here?" "Not long," Hayward replied. If we don't find a way to get back to the human colonies soon, we won't have the energy to make it anywhere. And the Zorath? I know, Cross cut him off. The Zorath will be coming for us. We don't have time to rest. They had evaded the Zorath once, but Cross knew that wouldn't last. The Zorath were ruthless, and their pride had been wounded. A wounded empire was a dangerous one. Ensign Jensen, find the nearest human outpost, a colony, anything, Cross ordered. We need to get to safety, and we need to do it fast. Jensen's fingers flew across the console. There's a small colony on the outer rim of the Norin system. It's a low-priority outpost, not heavily fortified, but it's the closest one. We might be able to make it there if we push the engines. Then that's where we're going, Cross said, his tone firm. Set course for the Norin system. Hayward, get us there as fast as you can. I'll be in the engine room. Understood, Hayward said as he started adjusting the course. Cross didn't hesitate. He stormed off the bridge, heading straight for the engine room. He had to see the damage firsthand. The Vanguard wasn't going to hold together much longer, and he needed to know just how bad it was. When he arrived, the engine room was a mess. Sparks flew from one of the conduit panels, and the air smelled of burning metal and overheated circuits. Engineer Lieutenant Monroe was working with a team of technicians, trying to keep the engines online. How bad is it? Cross asked, his voice tight. Monroe glanced up, sweat beading on her forehead. Captain, we're running on borrowed time. The engine core is barely functioning. If we push it any harder, we'll risk a full meltdown. We need to pull back. We don't have time to pull back, Cross replied, his voice grim. We need to make it to Norin. Can we at least get enough power to jump to hyperspace? Monroe hesitated, looking down at the console. Maybe, but we'd be cutting it close. The Vanguard isn't meant for long-distance jumps, not in its current condition. If we don't make the jump perfectly, we'll be stranded out here. Cross clenched his jaw. There was no other choice. We don't have another option. Do it. Understood, sir, Monroe said, and the technician team set to work, making adjustments to the engine core. As Cross turned to leave, he could hear the distant hum of the engines revving up, a sign that the ship was trying to gather its remaining strength. The countdown was ticking. If they didn't jump soon, they'd be sitting ducks for the Zorath. Back on the bridge, the tension was palpable. Jensen was still working the communication console, trying to hail any nearby ships or stations. No response, she said, frustration creeping into her voice. The Zorath have blocked all channels. We're completely isolated. Cross clenched his fists. They were alone, completely alone. We can't afford to be picky, he said. Keep trying to reach Norin. We'll need backup when we get there. Suddenly, the ship shook violently, throwing everyone off balance. The lights flickered and alarms began blaring across the bridge. Cross's heart dropped. What the hell was that? Hayward shouted, struggling to maintain control. Damn it, Jensen cursed. They found us. The Zorath fleet just dropped out of hyperspace. They're right on top of us. Cross's mind raced. They didn't have the power to outrun them. They didn't have the firepower to hold them off. The Vanguard was a shadow of its former self, and the Zorath would be relentless. Activate evasive maneuvers now, Cross barked. Hayward, get us to Norin. We don't have a choice. We fight our way out if we have to. Hayward nodded, his face set in grim determination. He pushed the Vanguard forward, guiding it through a series of sharp turns as the Zorath fleet came into view. The Vanguard shuddered with each incoming blast, but it held together, defying every expectation. The Zorath ships were closing in fast, their weapons powered up and ready to strike. Cross could see the glowing barrels of their cannons charging, their deadly energy beams aimed straight at the Vanguard. Brace for impact, Cross shouted, his voice hard as steel. The first wave of blasts hit the Vanguard, sending the ship reeling. The hull buckled under the pressure and sparks flew from the walls. The crew held on tight, but they couldn't escape the inevitable. We're losing shields, Jensen yelled, panic creeping into her voice. We won't survive another hit. Focus, Cross snapped, gripping the edge of his chair. Keep evasive, keep fighting, we don't stop. As the Zorath ships closed in, the Vanguard fired its remaining weapons, an act of desperation, but one that might buy them enough time. A direct hit to one of the Zorath ships sent it spiraling out of control, its energy shields failing as it collided with another ship. The explosion was deafening, sending shock waves through the space around them. That's it, Hayward shouted. We're through, jumping to hyperspace now. The Vanguard lurched forward, and the familiar hum of the hyperspace drive activated. The stars outside stretched into streaks of light as the ship jumped into the void, leaving the Zorath fleet behind. Cross let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. They were safe for now. But as the Vanguard hurtled through the vast, empty expanse of hyperspace, he knew one thing: the Zorath would be back, and next time they wouldn't underestimate humanity. The Vanguard jumped through hyperspace, its battered frame groaning as the ship navigated the swirling tunnel of light. For a brief moment, everything was still, silent save for the hum of the drive and the faint echo of the crew's labored breaths. The ship had barely survived the ambush. The Zorath were relentless, and though the Vanguard had bought some time, Cross knew they would be pursued relentlessly until there was nothing left. The tension on the bridge was palpable. The crew was exhausted, drained, but their resolve had not faltered. They had survived. They were alive. For now, that was all that mattered. Cross stood at the helm, watching the stars streak past the viewports, his mind spinning with everything that had just happened. The Vanguard had been outgunned, outclassed, but still they had fought back. They had proven something to the galaxy that day. Humanity would not be pushed around, not anymore. Jensen's voice broke through the silence. "We're exiting hyperspace, Captain, preparing to drop into the Norin system." Cross nodded, his eyes narrowing as the stars around them began to slow and shift into the familiar starlight of real space. His fingers tightened on the armrest, his heart pounding in his chest. "Keep an eye out for any signs of Zorath ships," he ordered. "If they found us once, they'll track us down again. We don't have much time." The Vanguard dropped into the Norin system with a violent shudder. The ship had made it, but the real battle was just beginning. Humanity's last hope had defied the odds once more, but the galaxy's mockery had turned to fear, and that made them more dangerous than ever.